it's a timely question. I don't know if you followed the news today or not, but there is growing tension in the Middle East, in and around Saudi Arabia, that has spiked the price of oil. Actually, I was going to look to see, and the price of oil is so very much linked to what is going on the global stage. But yeah, the price is up. It's up considerably. I don't expect it to stay up, but you see a sense, or you get a sense of the values that you talked about, the cultures in and around the Middle East, and how they tend to find themselves in conflict at times. And we're seeing that today, as a matter of fact, and it's helping to drive that price of oil up. But we are seeing overall a depressed commodity environment where companies are substantially cutting back their drilling programs, and ultimately that's resulting in reductions in workforce. We at Enable had one just, what now, Sandra, 2 weeks, week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago. We reduced our workforce by approximately 10%. Again, not really a function of anything we did, but it's really a function of what is going on globally. And what happens globally has ramifications here at home now. And it's something that, while we may not be communicating on a global scale, we're actually very interested in what is happening from a communications perspective around the world, because it will ultimately have an impact on our business.
Okay, we're ready.
Did I tap dance long enough?
Yes, perfect. Yeah, you were doing it.
So, you know, one of the things too that, and Sandra made mention, Sandra spent a lot of time at OGE on smart technology and introducing smart technology. Well, we're seeing a much greater global influence here at home, and you know, having to reach global audiences or unique audiences that are not from the U.S. is becoming more and more of something that we have to be mindful of. Not necessarily in our business, in the energy sector, but a lot of consumer companies are now having to be very focused on reaching much more targeted audiences that are from other parts of the world. As we rolled out our smart technology at OGE, Sandra and I were both there, you know, you have very large Vietnamese population in Oklahoma City now. You have a large and growing Hispanic population, and an understanding in how to reach those audiences was very important. They look at energy and energy consumption much differently than we do in the U.S., and then have to really think about how we approached those communications. So, with that, you know, one of the things that we talked about as we were kind of getting ready for this is that, you know, generally people are people. We all value information. We all want to know more, but it's really all about the context in which we find ourselves and how we are able to understand and digest that information. You know, we think about it. You and I, or you know, you guys in the room, myself. There's demographic difference, there's location difference, there's country. We're from different parts of the world. We're from different parts of the country, the state, even from across town. We can look at things much differently. And when we think about it in the global context, then all of a sudden now we're stacking cultures on top of that. We're stacking politics on top of that. We're stacking media differences on top of that. Maturity in terms of channels. And I think Sandra may talk a lot about channels and how mature those are. Here, we don't see a big transition of maturity in our communications channels from a rural and urban setting. We are still able, through our technology, to access a lot of different, or a lot of news and information wherever we are. But you step outside the U.S. and that starts to change dramatically. this next slide, this is, I apologize in advance because this is me getting to be academic, and I am not academic by any stretch. But as I was thinking about this, I really dug this map. Have you guys seen this map at all? This is from the World Values Survey, and it's something that you mentioned values, not specifically energy, but the World Values Survey, and this is the World Values Survey cultural map. And this is not I couldn't find a really good image of it, but along this axis, it should say traditional values, and up here is secular rational values. The traditional values, this group is very, as you're more toward this end of the spectrum, this group is very hierarchical, very clannish, very family oriented, and as you move up, you get to a more independent mindset, less family oriented, less hierarchical structures. And then as you move from this axis, this is more of a survivalist or survival mentality or survival values, whereas out here is more of a self-expression values where you find more of the individualist mindset out here. And it was interesting to see how countries shook out in terms of their values. And I thought it was intriguing how you had subsets like Indonesia and Ethiopia that really aren't anywhere near each other, but yet you see some value, some similar values. And that board's kind of vibrant. So is that like a smart board and I'm messing with it or something? It's kind of strange. Okay. Maybe it's just me.
It is smart board, but it's not activated.
Okay. So and I put this in just really because I thought it was interesting to see how the different cultures and values across the globe kind of shake out, because we think about a lot in terms of when we start thinking about hitting a target audience here at home, we kind of go through a lot of the same machinations of understanding exactly who that audience is, what that target is, what we're trying to connect with them. And it very much is about context. And Sandra had this great slide that I thought was really intriguing, because the context, if you think about these glasses in terms of context, and you fill these things with messages, and that message is very much dependent upon the context in which we find ourselves. And I think that's true for us practicing here at home, or for those that practice on a global scale. I'm just seeing if there's anything. I think the other thing when you think about context too is we start thinking about things like how we communicate and humor. And one of the things that I've discovered is that humor is by far the most difficult communication to execute, because it's so difficult to get right, and it can go so terribly wrong very quickly, and we try to avoid it if we can. Sometimes the situation calls for it, but when you start thinking about executing humor on a global basis, it doesn't work, and we've got an example or two of how that doesn't work. And I'm sorry and my bad can mean the same thing unless you're at a funeral. And my bad means, well, I'm responsible for the death. And so you got to think about how we use humor and make those connections. And this next one I thought was really, really good.
Consider the context.
A woman's
Context.
body changes over 500 times a day, which can cause odor. Zeus.
Context. I think it's so terribly important, not only from a global perspective, but for us from a local perspective. We all look at things differently, and we all have a different mindset that we bring. And as communicators, we have a very daunting task to understand that context, because we have such a diverse audience mix that we contend with these days, that we have to be ever mindful of how our messages are going to frame with a variety of different targets. And those can vary, and sometimes we'll have to modify those messages, tweak those messages to ensure that we are hitting the right targets. And as we become more global, and as we see a growing global diverse population in and around us here at home, and more broadly across the country, we have to keep those things in mind. And Sandra's going to pick it up from there.
So we truly believe that there are some universal principles of effective communication. Yes, your context changes, but you need to understand, you need to know the answers to these questions. So what's your desired outcome, right, from the communications that you're contemplating? Maybe your client comes to you and says, we need something, and you're like, well, what do you need it for? What are you hoping people will believe or do or think once they receive this communication? So that's a lot of what we do, I think, as communicators, is help the organization or that client focus on what is it they're really trying to do. Occasionally you'll get people who come to you and say, I need a brochure. And you're like, for what? And they just had on their goals that they were going to have that, or they were going to do advertising that year, or they've always done advertising. And you're like, well, what do you hope to accomplish with it? So it doesn't matter whether you're doing this in Oklahoma City or you're doing this in Barcelona, Spain. You've got to know what your desired outcome is. You also need to know, obviously, identify who your target audience is. And these are all part of that planning and research stage that you all have heard about and continue to hear about. And it's true. You need to do these things if you want to be successful in your communications, again, whether it's here or it's Malaysia. You've got to be able to do these things ahead of time so that you understand what it is you're trying to communicate and what you want people to do once they receive that communication. And then what's the context for them receiving that communication? So understand what's been happening in that environment with those people before you just put some content together and send it out there, because the content can vary depending on what context they're currently experiencing. And that context can change. Even while you're sending those messages out, something could happen. Let's say you're sending a safety message about pipeline safety, let's say in Oklahoma, and you're sending out messages to, make sure you know that there's pipelines in your neighborhood, and that, we as a company are doing everything we can to make sure that you're safe, and should something go wrong, we work with the emergency responders, and then an accident occurs. That message very much changes, right? How are we responding to that? What happened as a result of that? Did we follow protocol? Did we change our protocol because now something has occurred that was different than what we even had planned for? And I was talking to, who was I talking to? Tam, at lunch today, and we we're talking about how you have to be able to think creatively, even if you've done a crisis management plan, crisis communications, and you have templates and you know what your messages are going to be should a pipeline blow up, or you know what your messages are going to be should a plane go down. The circumstances of that actual incident may change what you say, may change how you say it. That plane that went down between Barcelona and, was it Dusseldorf? Depending on where it went down, depending on what government you're dealing with, depending on who was on the plane, all of that could change how you respond. So you've got to understand the context for the incident, the context for your target audience. Again, it doesn't matter where you are, you've got to understand those things to be effective in your communications. So again, all part of the context you need to understand if you're doing any messaging in that environment. Wherever you are, you need to understand how they're using the different channels and what kind of information they like to receive via that channel. That's the same true everywhere, right? Again, it's just a little harder sometimes when you're here and you're trying to communicate in a context you don't really know. So you really have to learn, and that's why a lot of times, obviously, you use those local agencies and local people to help you with that. And even here locally, as Brian mentioned, when we were communicating with the Spanish-speaking community about smart meters, we worked with a local Spanish-speaking PR firm to help us understand maybe we need to fine-tune some of our messages, maybe we need to deliver them in a different way. And it was actually much more family-oriented context for that, that target audience, and much more into events. So if you introduce them to that information during an event, a soccer watch party or something like that, they were more likely to hear what you were saying than if you send them a flyer to the home or in their bill. It's just a different way for them to receive their messages, much more orally focused. So again, the context is what we're hoping for here, and you understand the channels. And I guess the example I was thinking about, and it's kind of painful for all of us right here in this room probably, but a conversation about racial bias. If you held that in Ferguson, Missouri, or Norman, Oklahoma, is going to be very different than if you hold it in another community right now, right? We're living it. And so, again, you've got to understand that culture before you start introducing your messaging in that context, before you start introducing your message into that, because it's going to be shaped by it, just like the water's shaped when you pour it into the glass. In particular, I was thinking too about an example of the health workers with Ebola crisis last year, both in West Africa. What was the challenge there in terms of the types of messages, and what did you want to happen as a result of those public health messages? And then when the gentleman came to the United States in Texas and was diagnosed with Ebola. So two different contexts, same issues, same concerns in a lot of ways, but how were those handled? And how did that context affect how those could be successfully, or in some cases not successfully handled? So in Ebola in West Africa, in that context, you had previous outbreaks that had occurred in Africa, but they were fairly isolated. This was really the biggest one, and it was growing daily, exponentially. You had local funerary customs which allowed the virus to be contracted much more quickly, and the people didn't recognize it because it was their custom to treat the body in that way, to be in contact with the body, to kiss the body, to dress the body. And so all of that was part of the context that they were receiving messages about, don't do that. Stop doing this thing that you've done for generations because it's exacerbating this outbreak. Tough messaging. Eating bushmeat apparently is very common, and that bushmeat could actually have the virus in it. So that was a context that you might not have known when you were going there as an American public health official trying to help in that situation. You had to trust the local people to help you understand that context. Improper handling of the patient as well as of the protective gear. They didn't have a lot of protective gear, so understanding that context. And then the denial of diagnosis. Many of the people did not want to go to a hospital, did not want to be diagnosed because of the stigma and because it was a death sentence as far as they were concerned. So I don't know if you know anybody like this. My husband's like this. He won't go to the doctor because he doesn't want to get any bad news. So if I don't go to the doctor, I'll never find out that I have, whatever this problem is. So I think it's the same kind of thing. They didn't want to go to the hospital because then you'd confirm for me I may have a problem and I may die, and I don't want to hear that. So that obviously was not a very smart thing for people to do, but it's very understandable why they did that. And they didn't have a lot of trust in their government, so their government telling them to do something wasn't going to make them do it, wasn't going to make them change their funerary customs. So there was some research done by the Harvard Business Review and Stanford, I think it was, and they talked about the effectiveness of the communications, at least at the beginning of the outbreak last year. And what they found was the most effective social behavior and change communications, which has an acronym, SBCC. The SBCC, the most effective way was what they called entertainment education. So if you told a story to the people of West Africa about a family that had Ebola in their family and how they handled it correctly or didn't handle it correctly, whichever, you told this fictional story, the people of West Africa were more likely to feel a part of that, understand it, and say, I need to do the right thing if this happens in my family. So educational entertainment actually was the way to get the message across to them rather than a straightforward, get to the hospital, get away from those people if they have Ebola, let us take care of them. If they die, you can't handle them, we have to handle them. You know, I mean, those kind of that message didn't work. But an entertainment message did work because they could put themselves in that story. You have to understand the context for which they were receiving that information. So again, here was the context, more about how the outbreaks that had occurred so far. So back in 1976, in the Democratic Republic of Congo was the first Ebola outbreak. And you can kind of see how they kind of went up and down, mainly in Africa. There were 1 or 2 in the United States, cases in the US, a couple in European countries, but in the Philippines. But mostly it was all in Africa. And then boom, last year, things go crazy, right? So the context is, this isn't an issue, Ebola, it's far away, it's in Africa, don't care, I'm in the United States of America. Ooh, it's kind of gotten big in Africa. I've heard a lot more media about it now. I'm getting a little more, you know, I'm learning more about this. How does this work? How do people get this virus? How are they treating it? Oh, our country has said that we need to get there and stomp out this wildfire before it comes to our shores. Well, what are the chances it is going to come to the United States, and how much am I at risk or my family at risk? So that's the context that this gentleman, Mr. Duncan, flew in to Dallas in September of last year, and 2 days after he got here, he wasn't feeling good. So he goes to the emergency room at the local hospital, and they check him out, and for whatever reason, I haven't read yet why, but they didn't ask him, have you been anywhere lately? Have you been in West Africa? Somehow they didn't communicate that he had traveled recently from the area where there was an Ebola outbreak. So they sent him home. Well, we think you just got the flu. Go home, you'll be better. 2 days later, the man is, you know, deathly ill. They bring him back to the emergency room, and they, September 30th, they announced to the United States, certainly public as well as the world, that we had our first case in the United States of the Ebola virus. And the family is quarantined by the Dallas public officials, which was really counter to what they were doing in Africa. If a family, if someone in my family had gotten Ebola, they would have obviously taken that person out of the home, but they also would have taken us out of that home because the virus lived in that home. In the United States of America, we made the family stay in this apartment where the virus had been because the local public officials were worried about the rest of the public and didn't think about what was happening with this family. So they really were counter to what they were doing in other parts of the world. And it didn't make sense to us as we were learning more. Why would you treat people differently in the United States than you're treating them in Africa? So that was the first disconnect, I think, when we started getting the information out of the Dallas incident. And again, our context was what we'd heard was going on in Africa. Now, why are we doing it differently in the United States of America? And what the research showed was that the CDC and the president even talked a lot about, you know, we have the greatest public health system in the world, we can contain this, everything's going to be all right, this is an isolated case, we've caught it in time, we're following our protocols. And probably what they should have said was provide much more what they called anticipatory guidance. So they should have said, every outbreak is different, and we talked about this with Tam too. Every one of these, as much as you plan, as much as you have protocols, as much as you have templates in place of what your messages would be, they're going to change based on the context and what the actual details are of that event. You have to admit your failures. Hospitals should have said, and I understand why they didn't. I'm sure their attorneys told them not to say, oh, we didn't ask him where he traveled. Or we asked him, but we forgot to tell, you know, the head doctor, and he went ahead and sent him home. So you've got to admit your failures in this case, and you've got to provide anticipatory guidance. So you've got to say, right up front, the CDC should have said, we do have the greatest healthcare system in the world. We do have protocols to cover this. But we also know that every incident is different. We know that we will adjust as we learn more about this individual case and the people that he's been around for those few days that he's been around before we knew he had Ebola. Again, we will make mistakes, but we will fix those mistakes, improve our policies, and improve our protocols moving forward. That would have been a much more, it would have engendered much more trust from the American people in our CDC and our public officials if they'd have said that. Instead, they went back to the tried and true, we've got the best public health system in the world and this isn't going to spread. And what happened? What happened after this guy was diagnosed? Sure enough, one of his healthcare workers, two of his healthcare workers actually got it, right? They had to be quarantined for the 21 days. And then we had a couple of healthcare workers who'd been helping in West Africa who came back to the United States, right? So this was all part of that context of the messaging we're receiving out there. And we were becoming much more intelligent about what was going on. So some of those tried and true messages about we have the greatest healthcare system in the world. Well, obviously it's not the greatest because look, so-and-so got it. Obviously your protocols in Texas at the Presbyterian Hospital weren't good enough because nurse so-and-so got it. So again, you've got a disconnect there. You've got to understand the context, and you've got to understand how the context is changing even as you're communicating with them. So I thought that was kind of an interesting example, and there's much more I'm sure that will be done on that case study as we move forward. And it's still, I mean, there's still an outbreak that's occurring. That we'll continue with. But in fact, I noticed today the CDC has put out their 2015 TIPS campaign that are anti-e-cigarettes. So I wanted to look and see how they were approaching that communication to get, I'm not sure who all smokes e-cigarettes. Does anybody in the room smoke e-cigarettes? Is it people who are trying to get off regular cigarettes? Is it young people now who maybe never even smoked cigarettes? I don't know, but by reading this, I really couldn't tell for sure who their audience was. So that's probably a concern. Yeah, usually you can kind of tell whether you're the market or someone else is the market for this idea or campaign. But that might be interesting for someone if you're doing any work on communications to look at that particular campaign for the e-cigarette, trying to get people to get off of the e-cigarette. So the timeline there, I think what we wanted to do was allow time for conversation. So we have one more video that shows a great campaign, global campaign, or an international campaign that was done in Brazil. And they really understood the context of their communications area.
Throughout Brazil, there is a lack of blood in the blood banks. In the blood bank of the state of Bahia, the situation wasn't different. It's a fact. People only think about donating blood when someone they really like is in need. So to increase the donations, we made an invitation for people to donate blood for their greatest passion, their football team.
O esporte começa falando de uma novidade.
O Vitória conseguiu mobilizar a torcida.
Teve uma ideia criativa. Mudou até o tradicional uniforme rubro-negro do time.
Por motivo nobre, doação de sangue.
We took off the red from the traditional jersey of Vitória from Bahia, one of the most important teams in Brazil, with more than 100 years of history. For the color to come back, fans would have to do their part, donate their blood for the club.
A campanha em prol do Imóvel foi lançada sábado no jogo contra o Havaí.
Vitória sempre deu sangue por você. É hora de retribuir.
Parabéns, ô Vitória. É um rubro-negro que tirou vermelho porque tá faltando sangue no Brasil e na Bahia.
A cada jogo, uma listra vermelha na camisa, simbolizando o número de doações.
O Vitória está fazendo uma campanha para doação de sangue.
E assim voltar a vestir as cores rubro-negras.
Isso aí vai virar relíquia aí na história do Vitória, né?
A gente sabia que ia ter uma repercussão nacional, mas a repercussão internacional realmente foi uma grande surpresa pra gente.
Meu sangue é rubro-negro. Chega ao final nessa terça-feira.
Uma parceria entre o Vitória e o Hemoba aumentou o número de doadores de sangue na Bahia.
Eu acho que eu nunca fui tão impactado quanto essa campanha do Vitória.
So I know that was kind of fast when it came through there, but I'll ask you, What did they identify that they wanted to accomplish, you think? What were they trying to accomplish with this campaign? Increases in blood donation, right? So what were their metrics? You saw some of them flash up there at the end. 46% donations were up. That's pretty substantial.
How are they getting the numbers for the amount for the media? They said like 8 million in media placement. Do you know how they calculated that?
Oh, a lot of times, there's formulas that are used to say if you have this many minutes or you have this much, these many inches, then it equates to this much money. That's how they determine.
Probably using an ad equivalency value with a promotion multiplier.
It's not an exact science.
Yeah, it's not an exact science, but usually what you'll see people do is they'll create an ad equivalency. So what is that value of that TV time if you were to buy advertising? And then they'll put a publicity multiplier on top of that. Usually I think 3 times is what you see more often than not. I'm not exactly sold on it.
Because you're more likely maybe to listen and believe in the message if you don't think it was paid for. So that's the multiplier he's talking about. So this much if it was a bot ad, this much more because it was the news station.
Yeah, it wasn't purchased. It wasn't paid media.
The advertising equivalency value has been around for a long time in terms of how do we measure the effectiveness of public relations. But as you know, and we'll talk more about it in the weeks, and as you also know, this is not the perfect way to really measure the success. And right now, the Global Commission on Public Relations Measurement, in fact, and the Barcelona principles that came out of it a couple of years ago push professionals to think beyond the advertising equivalency value for the exact same reason that it does not really capture the whole spirit of what it happens. But we are in the process as the industry to search for the best ways of effective communication of your value to the management. And that value needs to be translated in the dollars, right, in the amount of the bottom line. So the conversation about the triple bottom line together with the Commission on Public Relations Measurement right now is really big. How do we capture the amount of the money that we get, beyond just the equivalency of advertising, but how do we really calculate how much your brand costs and how do we calculate how much your reputation costs and put it all on the table. And that's a big...
It is. One of the most difficult tasks you will have as a professional is measuring and demonstrating the success in a meaningful way. For me, the best number there was a 46% increase in donations. Now, the thing is, now you got to focus on sustaining and how do you continue to keep that moving forward. But ad equivalency, you're going to find a lot of leaders, a lot of management types, a lot of finance and accounting folks. They get really ginned up when they see an ad equivalency number.
That's true.
They think that's really great, but then we know, I can do press releases all day long and really fluff that number up, but am I making a difference? And that's what we are focused on as an industry is how do we understand what the difference is we're actually making?
But I think you can see that they did a very good job of understanding the context, right? They understood what about their target audience there. Do they like soccer or do they not like soccer? Do they love their team or do they not love their team? And as you know, in Brazil as well as a lot of other countries, soccer is it, right? I mean, you live and die around your soccer just like you do football around here. Yes, sir.
Oh, question. I didn't know, for this campaign, was this by a Brazilian public relations firm or an outside firm that went into Brazil?
Leo Thompson was involved. I think they're associated with a firm there in Brazil. So I think it was a local firm, but they owned by Leo Thompson.
Okay.
Yes, which is global. Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you for coming
Sure.
to speak to us. I sometimes moonlight as a teacher here, so you can ask the questions. And I have eaten bush meat. It's quite tasty. I just want to.
There you go.
But I didn't. If I knew you had Ebola, I wouldn't have eaten it. I don't have Ebola.
Has it been 21 days since you ate that Ebola meat?
What I wanted to ask you is, how have you gone about communicating this issue of distrust that people have a smart mistake, and especially not in the dominant community, but also in this unique context you keep talking about in the Hispanic community? How have you gone about it? Because I hear about smart meters, even I get scared. I don't even know what they are, but When you listen to me every time I go to the shower. I don't know. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you've done it?
I can tell you that occasionally we would get those concerns from customers, and they'd say, well, you're going to know when I'm on my computer because my energy use has gone up. I can assure you that the utility company is not monitoring every person's use moment by moment to say, ooh, they turned a light on. Ooh, and other people had said, well, you're going to know when I'm not home because I have no energy use. And I'm like, and you could come rob me. Someone could rob me if they hacked into the system and knew I wasn't home because there's no electricity being used. A robber can sit outside your home and know when you leave your home and know you're not home, right? So there were a lot of those unfounded fears that people just hadn't thought it through. And why would they? We haven't had that ability before. But the information obviously you want to be assured that it's protected, just like all of our information that unfortunately sometimes does get shared when it shouldn't be. But really, what could someone do with your energy use information? You know, as the more you think about it, it's like, I don't know. If the government wants to know if it thinks you're doing something illegal, they could come to us with a court order and we could give them your records now before we ever had smart grid. So there was nothing new or different about that. The Hispanic community, I think, was more concerned about us coming on their property and changing out the meter. Why is there a need for you? Is there a cost to me? And why are you coming into my yard to change out my meter when I'm not home? Because they didn't have to be home. We could just do it at any time of day. And then, what's the value to me of you doing that? Well, the value was, in particular, for many in the Spanish-speaking community, they rent more than they own in a lot of cases. So that in and out, I can get my service turned on or off very quickly now within a day versus having to wait 3 days sometimes. So there were some benefits, as well as if you want to take the time to become part of the group that looks at the website that sees your energy use, you can start lowering your energy use. And you can start looking at it. We were talking about this at lunch. In Oklahoma, for whatever reason, it may be true in a lot of other states, haven't researched it, we're competitive. So if I see my neighbor is using, and it's not specifically my neighbor, but people in my zip code are using energy more efficiently than I am, because we all kind of have about the same size house. Oh, I don't like that. So what we found was people love to see that in their area. How were other people, how efficient were they? And then they would start becoming more efficient in their energy use because they had to beat the other people, the most efficient people in their neighborhood.
The other thing is they hate their electric bill.
Oh, yeah.
And anything that we could provide them to mitigate that electric bill. The one thing that I would add to what Sandra said, and it's terribly expensive, but the question was asked earlier, what is, our most successful channel or our most effective medium? It's a face-to-face conversation. It's having dialogue. And we did not receive an inordinate number of just adamant, do not put that meter on my house. I think it wound up being less than 50. I mean, it was a very...
Less than 50 people
right.
out of hundreds of thousands.
Out of 800,000 plus customers.
It was great.
And and most of those were mitigated through just a conversation, just sitting down with the homeowner or the business owner and having the conversation, answering their questions was huge. And it's hard to do on a large scale, but if you can find the opportunity to do it, take the opportunity, because there is no substitute for having dialogue.
And we trained our technicians when they were out in the field to be ready for those conversations should the homeowner be home when they're there, or the business owner, and they had a concern. They had a concern maybe about the, electromagnetic frequency that's emitted by the smart meter, EMFs, right? You hear about that sometimes. Well, the proportion of EMFs that you receive from a smart meter on your home is so minuscule compared to your microwave and your cell phone and your baby monitor and your, all these other things in the home. But most of us don't know that. And so until you tell me, either personally, which was always better, as Brian said, or in some form of communication, then I go, oh, I'll look at this chart, and here's my little smart meter that's emitting maybe 2 or 3 times a day a short bursted message, and then here's my microwave, which I'm running for 10 minutes for my my baked potato, and then and I'm standing right in front of it watching it, which is worse. Don't stand right in front of your microwave. That's really not a good idea. Or my baby monitor, let's say, if I had one going. So as I got more information about that as a consumer, I went, oh, not a risk, not a concern. Okay, I want to move on to the next thing. And how can I use this to lower my bill? That was the other concern.
One more follow-up question, then I'll let the younger, smarter minds ask. When I hear the thing energy, how do you distinguish yourself? Because when people hear energy, they think Chesapeake, OG&E, Continental. People lump them all together. What do you say to people to make people understand what you do, and so you don't get the bad PR that people associate with other organizations? Like, what do you say to distinguish yourself?
It's an interesting question. One of the I think great experiences of my career was working with Sandra and another one of our team members.
Thank you. Oh, you're going to go on?
Yeah. And working to build or to create a brand from scratch. When OGE merged its pipeline business with that of CenterPoint Energies to create Enable, we had the opportunity to create that name, but also to create the brand around it. And as we were building that brand, we had very similar conversations sitting around the table. How do we distinguish ourselves from our competitors? How do we distinguish ourselves within the industry, within the community? We need to think about this, again, from a different context. When we looked at research, one of the things that we saw that was very glaring in the research is that there was a very big gap between companies that focused on themselves and their assets and those that focused on the customer or the employee or the individual. This end of the spectrum really had no occupant in it from a brand perspective. And you look at that and it was an aha moment to think, man, we have a whole space now that we can carve out as our own to distinguish ourselves from the rest of the pack. And our brand is really built around a tagline. And if you watch Thunder games, I apologize, you've been beaten up with it now for the season, but it's being a partner in your success. And that tag is really about being a partner in the success of our employees, our customers, our shareholders, and the communities where we live and work. Because that's really what it's about for us. If we're not being a partner in your success, then we're not being successful. It's not look at our miles of pipe. It's not look at our assets or where we are, but the fact that we have a little bit different mindset, that we're going to focus more on the stakeholders of the organization rather than the stuff. And yeah, I think we've been successful with it. It's been now a year, just over a year.
I think the harder aspect of it has actually been, well, we haven't spent near enough externally in a lot of other markets besides this one because our headquarters are here and we just haven't had the budget to do it. But the hard part has been internally to build that brand and have our employees believe in it, not because they don't believe in it, they're not sure. When a company starts laying people off, how are you being a partner in my success, right? So the decisions you make as an organization have to support that brand. So if you make a decision, we knew it was going to happen at some point just given the oil and gas industry, how do we explain that to our employees in such a way that they say, well, I understand why you made that decision. It's still being a partner in the success of the employees, because if we're not successful as a company, we have no company, you have no place to work, right? So the market factors, the fact that the price of natural gas and oil is down and our customers are not drilling, means we have to adjust, and we have to adjust our budget. And we've adjusted it as much as we can before we have to start limiting our workforce, right, reducing our workforce. And 10% was less than what many other of our customers were doing. So it wasn't as bad. Still not good if you're the one affected, right? But it's that internal, making sure that we tell our leadership and work with our leadership, and Brian really is the one who sits at that table and says, when you make this decision, whatever it is, understand your employees are looking at through the lens of you're trying to be a partner in their success. How does this reflect that? So that branding internally is just as important, maybe more so than it was externally. And we haven't been quite as successful as we'd like.
No, that's true. But in that whole process, there was a very concerted effort to ensure that we were, even though we did have employees that were being impacted, that we were trying to be a good partner in their continued success, although it be outside the organization. But we wanted to make that transition as smooth as we could for them through severance.
So you give them a severance and those kind of things.
You know, trying to ease the pain of that separation.
Let's take one more question. I know somebody else wanted to ask, just to make sure that we get.
So did the context message make sense to you today when we talked about how important it is to understand what's going on with your target audience, not just them personally, but in the atmosphere and the environment they're in?
Well, I have a question. I guess when I think of like energy, people don't have a great relationship like with their energy. Like I have never gone to like pay my electric bill and be like, man, I have a great relationship with this company. I love my electric company. Like it never happened. For most people, I think it's the same thing, at least in the US. Is that like a same thing worldwide? Is that like a big problem? Because I know it's like a big problem here. So is that, you know, an international thing or is that an American thing? And how do you guys really like address that problem, or do you?
It's a common thing. You know, one of the things that OGE really worked on is trying to create a stronger connection to customers, and with, you know, products and services. That's really how we start to create a connection. We all have a connection with Apple or Samsung because of the technology they provide us and the convenience and the coolie-hoolie stuff that it brings into our lives. Well, we're never going to get to that point from a utility perspective. But the utility needed to break out of the mindset of, you know, a centuries-old industry and start thinking about doing things differently, like an Apple or like a Google. And how do you begin to provide your customers with products and services that can actually start to make a difference for them long term? And that's how you solve the evolution of smart grid, the smart meter, the smart grid. And now you have products and services that you can actually pull up on your computer. You can see what your electric bill is at any point in time during the month. You can start to make substantial changes in your energy use to manage that cost over time and put more control into your fingertips as a consumer. Whereas in the old paradigm, the bill showed up at the end of the month and you were usually stunned if it was July. Well, now you've got an opportunity to begin to impact that. And having a partner in the utility to provide you those services hopefully starts to create, it's not going to create a loving bond, but it's going to create a stronger bond, you would hope, just in the fact that, you know, the utility, one, has a keen interest in helping you manage that bill, because if you're not using more electricity, they're not having to build more power plants that are extraordinarily expensive and pass those costs back on to you.
But you know, we did have people come in from other countries when we were doing smart grid and ask us, how are you doing this? How are you communicating with your customers? And there were some differences, obviously, in the messaging, depending on whether you were in Singapore or you were in, there were some, I'm trying to think where it was it Spain? Maybe France, I can't remember, but you know, part of the savings for us in putting in a smart meter was that our meter readers didn't have to show up at your house every month and read your meter, right? The big savings. We don't have those guys out there, and it was mostly guys, some women too, walking 10 miles a day, checking meters and getting bit by dogs. And you know, there were safety issues, all kinds of issues related to that. Well, in this foreign country, I can't remember, maybe it was in Singapore, because don't they have a lot of skyscrapers, right, in Singapore, very dense and everything. All of their meter readers were just going floor to floor to floor to floor to floor to read meters. They weren't really going out to houses. That's not the way, you know, the context. But they were still seeing the savings that they needed because they didn't have to send people up these staircases and they had a lot of problems with their technicians having problems with their knees because of all the staircases up and the staircases down. So same issues, but a different context. And so then the messaging to the customers there and to the businesses were, we're going to keep your costs down so we don't have to send guys out to read your meters anymore because now you have this smart meter.
Dr. Tetsura, can I ask one more question?
One more, and this is it. This is the last question, 30 seconds, because
How
we
do I
do
get-
want to spend like 5 minutes of our time to talk about our global public relations.
So our addresses are brian.alford, A-L-F-O-R-D, Brian as in I-A-N.
Okay.
Brian.alford@enablemidstream.com, and I'm Sandra.Longcrier@enablemidstream.com.
Okay, quickly, how do I get your job? If I'm 22, how do I end up doing what you're doing? Because there's people are wondering,
Good question.
you have some really cool jobs. What are you looking for? If I have Ms. Juliana here or Ms. Restucia, they're bringing your resume to you. What are you looking for? And if it's too long of an answer, maybe we can chat another.
The minimum price of entry is being able to write. I mean, if that's a non-starter. If one of the things I'm going to look for first and foremost is the ability to write. The second thing I'm going to look for is experience and two other things. One is, and usually we've discovered this through an interview process, is critical thinking, strategic thinking ability, and business acumen. I mean, we are in a corporate environment, and so having a strong business acumen and critical and strategic thinking ability are paramount for us.
But I also think, and when people come in and do internships, I think sometimes because of the training we have from when we're in school, I've had several interns and I've said, hey, I need for you to build a spreadsheet for me to do blah, blah, blah. And they're like, okay, and they run away and go do it, and they come back, and it's not what I wanted. Now, there's various reasons for that. Either they didn't ask me any questions, which I'm fine with. Come back and ask me questions, because maybe what I said to you wasn't exactly clear. Or I really didn't know what I wanted either. The boss sometimes doesn't know exactly what they want. So it's okay to ask questions. And what I found is a lot of times young people come in and say, feel like if they ask a question, then they're going to think, I don't know what I'm doing. So I'm going to go ahead and do the assignment and get it back to them just like I did in school and hope it's right. And then we've wasted days, and you've got it back to me, and I'm like, no, that's not what I wanted. You should have asked me. I'm fine with you asking me questions. It doesn't mean you're stupid. In fact, it means you're smart. You're smart enough to know the question to ask. And to Brian's point about business acumen, I don't expect you to know everything about my business. I'm still learning about my business. But know what questions to ask. That's the important thing.
I think this is the perfect time for us to stop. Let's give a big round of applause. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure listening to you, and I enjoyed the discussion throughout.